Ever heard the phrase, "be careful what you wish for"? Well, Poland just learned that lesson the hard way. This Central European nation thought it had escaped the grips of authoritarianism in 2023, only to potentially slide right back in 2025. Let's dive into this roller coaster story of a country that can't seem to make up its mind about democracy, and why what happens in Poland matters for all of Europe. We'll explore how Poland went from communist dictatorship to democratic success story, then to authoritarian backsliding, then to democratic hope, and now? Well, that's the million-dollar question. Poland's modern story should have been a fairy tale ending. Instead, it's more like a political soap opera that keeps getting renewed for another season. After decades of communist rule, Poland pioneered the peaceful transition to democracy. The Solidarity movement, led by future President Lech Wałęsa, showed the world how to overthrow a dictatorship without firing a shot. Poland didn't just transition, it thrived. They pioneered shock therapy economic reforms, joined NATO in 1999, and became an EU member in 2004. Poland was the success story of post-communist Europe. Then came 2015. The Law and Justice Party won elections and systematically began dismantling the very democracy that brought them to power. Among other things, they did the following in only 8 years' time. They captured the courts by packing them with loyalist judges. They even appointed a loyalist as president of the Constitutional Tribunal. Therefore, the European Court of Human Rights judged that it was no longer impartial. They turned public media into government propaganda. The best example of this is when a company called Orlen, which is mostly government-owned, took over one of the country's largest regional press publishers. They intimidated journalists and NGOs by, for example, slamming them with lawsuits on a security threat basis when journalists wrote things the party disagreed with. They tried to secure their grip on the governments by holding illegal postal elections in Corona time. They abandoned this effort, but it still shows their ruthlessness. And they restricted rights of parts of the population, such as restricting women's reproductive rights, and created LGBTQ+ free zones in rural areas. The EU was not amused. Brussels froze over 100 billion euros in funds and daily fined Poland 1 million euros for undermining the rule of law by refusing to restore judicial independence. In October 2023, Polish voters said enough. Opposition parties formed a coalition that won parliamentary elections. Donald Tusk, the same liberal leader from before peace, returned as prime minister with promises to restore democracy. But there was one tiny problem. President Andrzej Duda, a PiS ally, still had veto power over all democratic reforms. So everything depended on the June 2025 presidential election. This 2025 presidential race pitted Warsaw Mayor Rafał Trzaskowski, a liberal and pro-EU politician, against Karol Nawrocki, a conservative historian backed by PiS. And the winner was Nawrocki, by just 369,000 votes out of 21 million cast. Quick side note, think about that for a moment, 369,000 votes. That's less than 1.8% of all votes cast. In a country of 38 million people, fewer people than live in the city of Lublin decided Poland's democratic future. If just 0.89% of voters had changed their minds, Trzaskowski would be president today. This is why every single vote matters. In an age where people often feel like their voice doesn't count, Poland just proved that sometimes the fate of an entire nation, and by extension, European democracy, can hinge on whether a few 100,000 people decide to show up at the polling station. Going back to the presidential race. Until this year, most Poles had never heard of Karol Nawrocki. The former museum director was PiS's surprise candidate, and that surprise worked. Nawrocki positioned himself as a regular Pole. someone who wasn't part of the political elite that has dominated Polish politics for 2 decades. This message resonated with voters tired of the endless battles between Tusk's party and PiS. But Nawrocki came with baggage. During the campaign, media revealed he allegedly had participated in street fights with football hooligans as an amateur boxer, allegedly scammed a pensioner out of their house, and worked as a luxury hotel security guard who introduced sex workers to guests. Nawrocki denied all these claims, and none of this seemed to matter to his voters. In fact, it might have helped, proving he was just like them, rather than a polished politician. Here's Poland's fundamental problem. For 20 years, the same 2 parties have dominated everything. Donald Tusk's party, now KO, formerly PO, and Jarosław Kaczyński's PiS have created what Poles call POPiS, a political duopoly. Since 2005, power has just bounced between these 2 parties. This duopoly has created massive polarization, splitting Poland between big cities versus countryside, between liberals versus conservatives, between scientifically versus practically educated, and between young versus old. Families don't speak to each other. People consume completely different media. It's like there are 2 different Polands existing in the same country. Many voters wanted to break this cycle. Nawrocki represented something new, or at least not the same old faces they'd been seeing for 20 years. Rafał Trzaskowski could have been the perfect candidate for democratic Poland and was the ideal candidate for pro-Europeans. The popular Warsaw mayor is multilingual, pro-European, and represents everything modern Poland could become. But some say his campaign made a fatal error, trying to win conservative voters by abandoning liberal positions. Trzaskowski, known for supporting LGBTQ+ rights, suddenly went quiet on social issues. The man who removed crosses from government buildings started criticizing unemployed Ukrainian refugees. He even had a beer with far-right politician Sławomir Mencen. This rightward drift alienated his liberal base without convincing conservative voters. Why vote for diet conservative when you can have the real thing? Meanwhile, Nawrocki stayed consistent with his conservative message, keeping his base energized while Trzaskowski's grew lukewarm. With Nawrocki as president and Tusk as prime minister, Poland is heading for 5 years of political gridlock. The new president has already promised to be even more obstructionist than his predecessor. The domestic impact of this attitude could be the blocking of democratic reforms, media freedom, judicial independence, abortion rights, and LGBTQ protections. The EU is not happy. After unfreezing 100 billion euros in funds for Poland's democratic transition, Brussels might be having second thoughts. Those judicial reforms that were supposed to restore rule of law? Forget about it. Nawrocki will veto them all. Just 6 months ago, Tusk was the EU's golden boy, leading the revived Weimar Triangle alongside France and Germany, showing other countries how to counter populism. Now he's among Brussels' walking wounded, a cautionary tale rather than a success story. Poland under Tusk had a great influence on EU-Ukraine policy. With Ukraine skeptic Nawrocki as president, we will have to see how big of a role Poland can still play. But Donald Tusk isn't going down without a fight. Stinging from his allies' narrow defeat, the Prime Minister announced he's calling a vote of confidence in his government, essentially daring his opponents to try and bring him down. I want everyone to see, including our opponents at home and abroad, that we are ready for this situation, Tusk declared. We understand the gravity of the moment, but we do not intend to take a single step back. It's political theater, really. Tusk's coalition has a solid parliamentary majority, so he was almost certain to survive the confidence vote, and he did. But the message was clear: he's preparing for 5 years of institutional warfare with President Nawrocki. Still, early parliamentary elections remain possible. If the constant presidential vetoes make governing impossible, Tusk might be forced to call new elections, potentially bringing PiS fully back to power. Poland's democratic struggles aren't just Poland's problem, they're Europe's problem. With 38 million people, Poland is too big to ignore, but too divided to lead. It's the EU's 6th largest economy and most important Eastern member. Yet it keeps oscillating between democracy and authoritarianism. The EU is stuck not knowing what to do. It can't really kick Poland out of the EU. Apart from being a harsh measure at this point, there is no mechanism for it. But it can't ignore Poland either. It's too big and important in the EU for this. The EU does have some tools, but they're limited. Triggering Article 7. This option could strip Poland of its EU voting rights, but it requires unanimity from all other member states. The procedure has already been started against Poland before, but Hungary, facing similar issues, will always block it. Withholding funds. As we've seen, the EU already froze over 100 billion euros and imposed daily fines. But this punishes Polish citizens as much as the government. Overall, it still means the EU can't interfere too much. So, what to do? Viktor Orban in Hungary has successfully consolidated authoritarian control, and Robert Fico is holding on to power tightly in Slovakia. Is Poland following the same path, or can it avoid the fate of other Visegrad group members? If Poland slides back to authoritarianism, what effect does that have to democracies nearby like Slovakia and Czechia, or all the other ones also further away? Democratic backsliding can be contagious. Poland's story offers crucial lessons for every democracy. Lesson 1: democracy is fragile. Democracy isn't something you win once and keep forever. It requires constant vigilance, commitment, and renewal. Lesson 2: polarization kills. When politics becomes tribal warfare, voters stop caring about democratic norms and just want their tribe to win. It kills any actual debate. Lesson 3: institutions matter. Strong courts, free media, and civil society are democracy's immune system. Weaken them and the whole system gets sick. Lesson 4: Europe's limits. Without institutional reforms, the EU can do very little to protect democracy in member states. And even less when democracy is dismantled by voters themselves, of course. Poland's story isn't over. It's just entered another complicated chapter. With President Nawrocki and Prime Minister Tusk locked in institutional warfare, the next 5 years will test whether Polish democracy can survive perpetual gridlock. The scary part? This isn't just Poland's problem. Across Europe, and across the democratic world as a whole, we're seeing the same patterns. Polarization is replacing dialogue, institutions are under attack, democratic norms are eroding, and voters are choosing strongmen over state leaders. Poland was supposed to be the poster child for successful democratic transition. Instead, it's become a forewarning of how quickly things can go wrong, how hard they are to fix, and how fragile democracy really is. But on the bright side, the Poles never give up. They've survived partitions, occupations, and dictatorships. They'll survive this too. The question is, what kind of country will emerge on the other side? For the rest of Europe, Poland's message is clear. Democracy isn't a destination you reach and then relax. It's a constant choice you make. Every election, every day, every time you decide whether to engage or give up. Poland chose democracy in 1989. They moved away from it in 2015. They chose it again in 2023, and 2025 is complicated. What will you choose when your turn comes? Because in today's world, everyone's turn is coming sooner or later. And when it does, Poland's rollercoaster journey shows us both the possibilities and the perils of keeping democracy alive in the 21st century. The story from Warsaw continues. The only question is, Will it be a comedy or tragedy? Want to learn more about democratic challenges in Europe and beyond? Then please subscribe for more videos.